You are listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast produced by Veteran Strategies and featuring conversations with fascinating and impactful men and women who have shaped our world, our communities, and our history. My name is Robert Vane, Principal of Veteran Strategies, and your host for our discussion. You are listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast presented by Veteran Strategies, an Indiana-based public relations enterprise, and sponsored by Girl Scouts of Central Indiana, Garmong Construction, Leaders and Legends LLC, the Grand Hall and Conference Center at Historic Union Station, the McGinley's Golden Ace Inn, and NFP, a national insurance broker with strong local content. Our podcast is featured on the All Indiana Podcast Network in partnership with Wish TV. You may find Leaders and Legends at allindianapodcastnetwork.com. Thinking of starting a podcast or need to host a public meeting? Let Leaders and Legends LLC be your partner as you look for new ways to communicate your message. Please contact Chris Spangle or me at leadersandlegends.net. As always, all our podcast interviews are dedicated to the legacy and generosity of P.E. McAllister. Thank you for joining us on the Leaders and Legends podcast. Our guest today is Steven McGregor, who is the author of an absolutely splendid book, co-author, called The Silver Waterfall: How America Won the War in the Pacific at Midway. Steven was, like all true patriots, a member of the United States Army. Thank you, Steven, for your service. I was going through basic training 36 years ago, right now, in the cold at Fort Knox. Hopefully you made a better choice.
My basic was in Colorado Springs. So, because I started off at the Air Force Academy, and then, it depends on how you look at it. I suppose I went down, in some respects into the infantry, but we ascend as well in the infantry. I did airborne school and air assault school, and so you get a bit of altitude when you have to jump out of a good airplane and or a helicopter or whichever it is. So I kind of got both worlds, and it was great.
Well, Steven was deployed to the Sunni Triangle of Death as an infantry officer in the 101st Airborne Division. Mr. McGregor, please don't hold it against me that when I was in the Army, I had a television show. While in the military, he earned the Combat Infantryman's Badge and the Purple Heart. Thank you so very much for your service. After his military service, he moved to England and completed a postgraduate studies in history at the University of Cambridge. Steven, thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Thanks very much for having me, Robert. It's great to be here.
So the Battle of Midway, we're going to talk a lot about that. That's basically the topic of discussion today. And as we were talking before we started recording, I guess we could talk about this. I'll say it the same way. I was hunkishly arrogant before I started to read your book because I've read so much about Midway. I really didn't think I would learn anything else. And after about 6 pages, I realized I was wrong. What makes the Battle of Midway so compelling and appreciative to you?
Oh, great question. Yeah, you're right. A lot of people have written about this battle, many great historians, and it's a very important battle. So it deserves a lot of attention. I think for me, and I guess in general, it's probably one of the greatest naval battles in American history. So I think on that basis, it's important to study and to understand what took place. I think then you could also say it's important because it's a great way into to learning about the Pacific War and the Second World War more generally. The Pacific was a theater. It was a very large theater, 3 times larger than the European theater. It was vast, very, very, a lot of complicated, complex scenarios there. And so it's often difficult when you start learning about of a war, you need some way to kind of to get a handle on things or to orient yourself. And I think starting with the Battle of Midway, which is such a critical battle from the U.S. and the Japanese perspective, which then has other effects on the European theater. That's another good reason. But I think for me personally, it was really striking when I first started learning about the battle, the kind of resonances. I mean, I just I never served in the Navy. I was in the Army, like I said. But there is this kind of similarity. You do recognize what it's like. These experiences. One of the main characters in our book, Dusty Cleiss, he's a very important figure in the battle, and I just really identified with letters he was writing home to his fiance and or his fiance, his girlfriend. Really, they kind of had this difficult relationship, and I mean, it was bizarre, actually, the similarity that you get. It's almost like war hasn't changed in some ways, and so that was I think for me personally why I really this story it was something I really enjoyed telling, and I thought it needed to be told.
My son Joshua did 2 tours as an 11 Bravo in Afghanistan, and the letters that he wrote to me, were obviously a little bit different than the ones you're describing. But I got the sense that people writing from combat zones tried to give the recipient of their letters a taste of what's happening, but not really the entire meal. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, absolutely. That's totally true. And I think as well, and this comes out with Dusty Cleiss and his writing. I think when you're writing home, what you want is you want courage. You're looking for virtue. You're looking for this sense that what you're doing has meaning, and you need this other world. You need home to exist, because that's almost the whole reason that you left home in the first place, is because you think that what you're doing is going to somehow preserve it. And so I think your son, that will be in what he's trying to say. And I mean, and you get a sense of that as well, like when you're reading what he's saying to you, and that he's kind of reaching out to this. It's almost it's almost as though what you're doing at home is just as important, if not more important than what he's doing. And you get that, like in Cleiss, when he's writing back to Jean and he's talking to her, because we have a letter that he actually wrote to her on the eve of battle, which we talk about in the book, and what he asks her for and what he says to her before he flies. So he's writing to her on the 3rd of June, 1942, the night before he goes into the Battle of Midway. And so it's just a matter of hours. I mean, he's just about to go to sleep, and he writes to her. So it's like, that is great history. It's a great story. But yeah, I think those kind of letters, they are really important.
Tell us a little bit, please, about the pre-Harbor. I want to set the stage for the battle in 2 particular ways. One is to tell us a little bit about the pre-Pearl Harbor American military buildup and how important that was to Midway. Because if I remember correctly in your book, and you and Professor Sims, your co-author Brendan Sims, wrote an article in Time magazine that basically said nothing that happened after Pearl Harbor in terms of men or material made a difference, in the sense that everything that led up to the victory in the Battle of Midway happened before the war, quote unquote, started on December 7th.
Yes, that's correct. So what the U.S. brings to bear on the Japanese in the Battle of Midway, the key components of the U.S. victory in terms of the men and the machinery that are put into use in the battle, all of those things are developed prior to Pearl Harbor, and they're developed and they're put into use prior to Pearl Harbor. And I'll say more about that in a minute. But it's important also so if you read Paul Kennedy's recent book on the Second World War, and he talks about the navies, specifically, and he talks about how in 1943, that's really when the U.S. The scale of American the ships, it's really the amount of things that America was producing and putting into the water. It was just orders of magnitude greater than what the Axis powers had available. So really in 1943, the quantity shifts dramatically in favor of the U.S. But again, as you point out, and as we describe in the book, for the Battle of Midway, it's not a victory that's won by quantity so much as quality. It's really the quality of the U.S. equipment and the quality of the U.S. pilots in one particular aircraft that allows the U.S. to win the Battle of Midway.
Well, let me ask you a follow-up to that. One of my favorite quotes about the United States is from Sir Edward Grey, who lives right where you're living there in England. And he compared the United States, and I don't know if it's quoted in your book or in Professor Sims's book on Hitler, which we hope to talk to him about. And I've read this quote many times, and it's my all-time favorite. Edward Grey, the foreign minister of Great Britain, likened the United States to a gigantic boiler and said there is no limit. Once lit, there is no limit to the amount of heat it can produce. Would you say that specifically in the war in the Pacific, this becomes true when the United States just starts to produce things in quantities that you just can't imagine?
Absolutely, yes. So yeah, I was born and raised in Florida, but about 14 years ago, moved when I got out of the Army, came back from Iraq, got out of the Army, is when I moved to England and married my girlfriend, who's an English woman. So that's how I ended up over here. But yeah, America, it's continental. It's sort of this colossus, and it takes a while for it to kind of get into gear. But once it does, it's very effective. It builds up a lot of momentum. But as I said, that's much truer. That really does bear. It's an important fact to bear in mind. Especially when you think about just even the geography. Japan, it's an island nation, similar to the United Kingdom. It's a union of island nations. But the United States is a continent, so much larger, just in terms of its size and then its manufacturing power and all of its resources, which the Japanese are aware of. This is one of the reasons why they think they need a short war if they're going to win against the United States. But again, with the Battle of Midway, one of the things that we point out in the book, which is somewhat counterintuitive, is that the technology and also the pilots and the sailors who allow the United States to win against the Japanese in this one battle, in this particular instance, they are the result of targeted small scale development. So it's not by the end of the war, for instance, by the end of the war, the United States has built almost 6,000 SBD Douglas Dauntless dive bombers, which is this very important plane, which we describe a lot in the book. We go into detail in the book. It's the most detail on this plane in any book about the Battle of Midway. And so by the end of the war, they've built almost 6,000 of them. But by the time of the Battle of Midway, it's in the hundreds. So that's all that's required, because on the day of battle, there's only something like 39 planes that dive on the Japanese carriers. So it's just 39 of that 39. Those are enough to make a difference. And obviously not all of them hit. It's only something like eight of them actually hit the Japanese. So in that one morning, in that 5-minute period. So at that point, you're looking at 8 planes which actually make a difference and bring about an important, this important victory.
So setting the stage prior to Pearl Harbor. The American government, President Franklin Roosevelt, the people, so on and so forth, decide, look, there's got to be, we know what's coming, perhaps eventually, but there's already war in Europe in September of 39, and maybe even a little bit before, if you want to talk about the appeasement period. So the United States industry and the American government say, we have to spend money, we have to build up our defenses. That's pre-Pearl Harbor. So you set the stage for that very well. Now set the stage for the Battle of Midway in the sense of what happens between December 7th, 41 and June 42. It's amazing that it's only 7 months between this amazing and, significant Japanese victory. And then 7 months later, you could argue it's over. I mean, the fighting's not over, but any chance the Japanese had is gone in 7 months. Or am I overstating it?
Well, I guess you can yes and no. So it's an overstatement in the sense that, as Richard Frank and some others point out, Guadalcanal that's the meat grinder where the War of the Pacific, it becomes a battle of attrition, and an enormous amount of life is lost on both sides, and the United States really proves that it's willing to go toe to toe to take ground in this island hopping campaign and their assault on the Japanese. So really, America's proving that they're willing to bleed and die to win this war to an extent that the Japanese really can't match. So that would say you could argue that Guadalcanal, which takes place later in 42, it lasts for months, but that's really when it begins. That is a much more critical phase of the War in the Pacific. However, Guadalcanal, the United States could have never orchestrated that assault without the victory at Midway, and so really the victory at Midway, the Battle of Midway in June, on the 4th of June, 1942, as you say, a matter of months after Pearl Harbor. That battle is what proves the war will not be a short war, because 4 of the 6 Japanese fleet carriers are destroyed in the battle. 3 of them are mortally wounded in just a 5-minute period of the battle. So very short period of time. You have the heart torn out of the Imperial Japanese Navy, and so this is what proves that the war will be a long war, and that is a war that the Japanese really can't win. They cannot win a long war against a continental opponent. Yeah, I mean they are a great navy, and that's another sort of point to bear in mind when you're thinking about the background to the battle, is that both sides have strong navies in a sense. But the Japanese are really much more battle hardened and tested. They've been fighting against the Chinese since 1931. So their pilots are much more experienced than the Americans, and they have great equipment. They have great ships. They have great planes. So they are a very capable naval force.
The Japanese fleet was supposed to be limited, and I'm going to see if I get my date right. Was it 1922? Is that the Washington Naval Treaty, where, am I correct? Stop me as soon as I say something that's wrong. That's limited the ratio, limited fleets. And the United States and Great Britain were supposed to have the 2 biggest fleets. And then it's like France and Japan and Italy. So in other words, Japan was supposed to have a smaller fleet, but they were unhappy with how they were treated as part of that treaty and decided to do their own thing. Is that fair?
Yes. So coming out of the Great War, there was an attempt. There was a belief that through diplomacy we could do away with war. The Kellogg-Briand Pact. You had this kind of this sense that through this is part of the League of Nations is part of this. So the U.S. never ends up joining. It's Wilson's idea, and it's part of this line of thinking that through diplomacy and engagement that we can get rid of the need for the loss of so much life, and for things like the horrors of the trenches. The Washington Naval Treaty, 1921, 22, when they get together to decide this, is essentially a way to have an agreement between the major powers that they will, and some of the lesser powers, that they will restrict the growth of their navies as a way to prevent an arms race. And the issue with this is, you have some countries, they lie about because the way it's designed, it's meant to be this ratio of tonnages. And so you have countries lying about the size of their ships. You have them developing ships. It's not necessarily unlike the way some things are going on now in the Pacific as we speak, because the number of ships that China has available for its amphibious assaults, for an amphibious assault, should one take place, it's hard to calculate, because they could potentially be using ships that are civilian ships for a military assault. They can reconfigure them in a short period of time, so they could say on paper, well, we only have this many, but actually, the real number is much greater. And you had similar things going on in the 1920s after this agreement, and certainly moving into the 1930s, when the navies were pushing at the edges of what was allowed, and then they just started openly breaking them. The Japanese were openly breaking their treaty obligations, and they were by the mid 1930s. And so the agreement, you could argue that it works because it restricts the development of some things, but in other ways, you could say it just it was kind of a hand wave. So that is part of the kind of deep background to the battle.
You are listening to the Leaders and Legends podcast. Our guest today is author Steven McGregor, who, along with Brendan Sims, wrote a terrific book, The Silver Waterfall: How America Won the War in the Pacific at Midway. I have several very kind review quotes about your book, Steven. I will read one. The Silver Waterfall is a story of authentic American characters, settings, issues, and heroism that will stay with readers long after they put the book down. And that is from General David Petraeus.
Yeah, that was much nicer than what he said to me when I met him in Iraq, actually.
I was just getting ready to ask you that.
I'm not sure.
David McGregor?
I'm gonna. It's like when you talk to royalty, you don't tell people what was said, and I'm not gonna quote what he told me. It was hilarious, actually. It was great. He is kind of one of these. They told us before he came. You have to be careful, because he would challenge people to push up competitions. Mm-hmm. Random Joes. He would just say, like 11 Bravos, like your son. He was like that. He was kind of, he would just kind of go off. If he saw something interesting, he would go over there and look at it and talk to anyone. And so, in a way, that's what great leaders do. They put people. They investigate everything. They're permanently curious and. So that was very kind of him.
It's not a metaphor, but the theme, the string that really holds your book together is the Douglas Dauntless dive bomber. You chose one particular plane. A, why? And B, it's a unique approach. And this is kind of a knucklehead question, so forgive me, but why do you think choosing the plane as the foundation of your book works?
Yeah, you're right. You wouldn't necessarily think that a plane is the key to this naval battle, but it is. And actually, that's one of the reasons why it's so important, because this is a huge change. If you think about someone like Chester Nimitz, he becomes the commander of the Pacific Fleet, and he receives this job after the attack on Pearl Harbor. Husband Kimmel, who's the outgoing commander, he's sort of cast aside because of the attack, because the U.S. is surprised, and Nimitz comes in. He arrives in Hawaii. He arrives at Pearl Harbor on on Christmas Day, the morning of Christmas Day of December 1941. And if you think about Nimitz, he's born in 1885. He enters Annapolis in 1901. The Wright brothers don't fly until 1903. So he's a midshipman when this new technology suddenly appears. And it's not until after the Great War that you then have the advent of aircraft carriers. And there's a huge debate. What difference is a plane going to make at sea? For the established culture in navies throughout the world is that the battleship is the ship that wins wars, and that is what's called your capital ship. Mm-hmm. Well, Nimitz decides in 1922, when he's at Naval War College, he will use the aircraft carrier, as his capital ship. And that will be the ship that he forms the rest of his fleet around to protect the carrier. And so that's why the plane, once he puts this change formation into practice in 1923, is when he's XO of Battle Fleet. This is when you start to see air power making a huge difference at sea. And Midway, the Battle of Midway, is where the capability of air power, and in the U.S. case, the Douglas Dauntless, it's just it's unmistakable. That is really the plane that allows. It's the technology that allows the U.S. to win the battle.
So a dive bomber dives and bombs. What else does it do? And why is diving and bombing so critically important, not just for this battle, but for others?
It is a simple skill. You're right. And you have a huge contrast the way a lot of warfare takes place now with this fire and forget technology and GPS guided munitions and all this with heads up displays and satellites, and a totally different kind of warfare. Because in dive bombing, the pilot becomes the weapon. Really, you are flying your bomb at the target, and the longer you hold that attitude where you're descending straight down towards the target, if you go from about 18,000 feet down to sea level in 2 minutes, the longer you hold that position, the more guaranteed you are that your bomb will go where you want it to, because your target's going to be moving at sea. Often your target is moving, and so you have to send your ordnance where you think the target will be once you release it. And yeah, this is a kind of technology. The Japanese are good at. They have a capable dive bomber. Nickname, it's the HE D3A1, nicknamed Val. It's similar to the American dive bomber. It has some noticeable differences. It's a much lighter plane. One of the reasons why the American plane is so good, the Dauntless, is so effective, is because it was a very heavy plane. It was very rugged. So it was about 10,400 pounds compared to the Japanese plane, which was 8,000 pounds. The Japanese plane is more agile and it can climb faster, but the American plane is able to withstand greater stress on recovery, because really when the plane comes down toward the target, it then has to recover. And you can only dive steep and recover steep if you have a strong plane. Otherwise, the wings will just come off. So what the Americans are able to do, one engineer in particular, Ed Heinemann, who we talk about a lot in the book, he designs an incredibly strong plane. The Dauntless is very strong. It's able to withstand an enormous amount of pressure on recovery. And what this means is that the Americans can bring 1,000-pound bombs. They can dive with 1,000-pound bombs, and the Japanese only have 550-pound bombs on the Val. So the strength of American equipment allows them to bring greater ordnance into the battle.
You are listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast presented by Veteran Strategies, an Indiana-based public relations enterprise, and sponsored by Girl Scouts of Central Indiana, Garmong Construction, Leaders and Legends LLC, the Grand Hall and Conference Center at Historic Union Station, the McGinley's Golden Ace Inn, and NFP, a national insurance broker with strong local content. Our guest today is author Steven McGregor. He, along with Brendan Sims, another terrific historian, wrote The Silver Waterfall, How America Won the War in the Pacific at Midway. Before we get back to the battle as we approach it, please give me your Mount Rushmore of the 4 most important naval battles in history.
Gosh, well, I mean, you could you could go a long way back for that. Definitely Battle of Jutland would be on that list. So that's a battle between it's mainly takes place between battleships and the Great War, the First World War, and something like that. You know, it's important because this is all part of the kind of development of this culture in Europe and in the U.S., where the battleship is essential. The battleship is how you win wars, and that's also the battle that Chester Nimitz in his that he studies in detail. He writes a dissertation on this battle. So you would think that actually, when you have battles like this, where the battleship is crucial, you would think that it makes it all the more unlikely that Nimitz is able to seize on air power and the aircraft carrier as kind of the technology that would allow for such great that would be so transformative.
And the battleship's also how you projected your diplomatic and political power. That's how you were counted. You know, when you read whether it's Massey's book Dreadnought about the naval war between the Brits and the Germans prior to World War I, that's how they counted their belts, right? Like, we're powerful because we have X number of dreadnoughts, and that's a hard thing. You know, the aphorism that you're always fighting the last war. That's what it seems to me that Nimitz broke out of so well.
Yes, and he also managed to change the entire culture around him, because you have, so his opposite number in the Imperial Japanese Navy, Yamamoto. He seems to be aware that air power is important, but he's not able to make the entire Japanese Navy come along with him in that realization. Whereas Nimitz does. Nimitz is able to, as I say, he's able to change the way that the American task force, where the ships are arranged for battle, he's able to make that change take root and take hold. And so I think that's where you see a contrast, because great leaders don't just see that things are going to change in the future. They can change the entire culture to recognize this. They don't just have this idea to themselves. They can persuade others of this. But yeah, I mean, I suppose to go back to your earlier question about important battles, I mean, I'd also list, if you think about the Battle of Tsushima Bay that takes place in 1905, I'm just thinking of other important battles specifically to understand Midway. Battle of Tsushima Bay is important because it's a battle between Russia and Japan. And one of the people who participates in the battle is Yamamoto, Yusoroku Yamamoto. He enters the Japanese Navy at the same time as Nimitz. They're born almost the same time. I think Yamamoto's born in 1884, and Nimitz is 1885. But they enter their respective navies the same year in 1901. When Yamamoto graduates, he then he ends up on a surface ship in the Battle of Tsushima Bay, and he's wounded in this battle. When a shell explodes next to him, he has something like 200 fragments sent up onto his back, into his back, and so he's a battle-hardened sailor. So he is a very capable leader in the Japanese Navy. And that battle, again, Battle of Tsushima Bay, it's another one of these instances where the battleship decides the outcome of the contest, and it seems to have a kind of echo in Midway, because the Japanese fleet departs Japan on the anniversary of that battle. And so it's as if you're seeing the way that the battleship and the big gun culture of the battleship, it's just ingrained in the Japanese fleet, whereas the Americans have figured out air power is the key. So yeah, perhaps Battle of Tsushima Bay, Pearl Harbor itself, Battle of Midway, and then we could go in for something like what takes place at Guadalcanal. And it's your 4 battles. I mean, we're not talking about Coral Sea.
We're not talking about Salamis.
Tricky. No, yeah, I did. Obviously, I'm thinking, well, do we go to the ancients and all this? I mean, yeah, because the Greeks survived and the Persians didn't come in. I mean, you could definitely do this, and I'd probably John Keegan is probably like that would be more of his approach. But if we just stay with our World War II theme, that will work.
One of the coolest things to read about in the Pacific Theater during World War II is the Doolittle raid. They take off from the Hornet shortly after Pearl Harbor. James Doolittle, who ends up being awarded the Medal of Honor, and they do this kind of perfunctory, hardly frightening raid over Tokyo that has this enormous emotional impact. Please talk a little bit about the Doolittle raid and how that led directly, if you think it did, to the Battle of Midway. In other words, the sense that the Japanese had some unfinished business at Pearl Harbor because the aircraft carriers were not there.
Yeah, so that raid is really something. And Brendan and I, my co-author Brendan and I, we actually got to meet a sailor who was on the Hornet for the Doolittle raid, Richard Nowatzki. So we wrote this. We started writing this book right before the pandemic, and we knew we needed to go to San Diego because they have this museum there, which has all these papers from the engineer who designed Douglas Dauntless. All of his private papers are there, his correspondence and all of this. And so we knew we needed to go and visit this museum. And so we go out there in January of 2020, and my wife was very kind. She's like, yeah, I watch the kids, you can go, and I won't hold it against you, forever. So we got to the museum, we saw the paperwork, and I found out there was this veteran who was living close by in Rosemont. So we drove out there, and it was amazing. I mean, he told us how it was great just to see him and see. He had all these books on Midway himself, and to hear his stories. And he told us it was kept secret. The mission was kept secret when they decided, because Pearl Harbor takes place. This is another one of the interesting things about the American response to Pearl Harbor. Pearl Harbor takes place in December of 1941. And it's a huge psychological impact. And the sense that America is now at war with this incredible foe, and America goes on the offensive. Now, part of this is because of Nimitz. It's because when Nimitz takes the job, when he's given responsibility for the Pacific Fleet, he wants to fight. He goes in this island hopping camp, this campaign of island raids. It's really what they are, and island hopping is later in the war. But these island raids, where he's attacking different positions in the Pacific, and part of this is the Doolittle raid itself, which is, you could think of it as a raid on Tokyo. And what they do is they send these long range bombers, these army bombers off the Hornet, and they just fly a one-way flight over Japan, drop their ordnance, and then into China, where they hopefully will escape. And they keep this mission secret. So the sailors, Rich Nowatzki told us when they departed, and it's announced on the loudspeaker what they're up to, because the guys have no idea. And he just said this enormous cheer went up on the ship because they realized they're going to go fight back. So yeah, it was a very important attack, the Doolittle raid, partly because it caused the Japanese to think that they needed to bring the U.S. fleet out as quickly as possible and in some way find a decisive victory. They wanted to create a decisive fight with the U.S. Navy rather than try and hold certain territory or move west. They had a lot of options, strategic options. But after the Doolittle raid, and they feel like Tokyo has been attacked, and Japan is viewed as sacred ground to the Japanese, they want a decisive victory with the U.S. Navy to end the war as quickly as possible.
Let me ask you another, you talked about it just a second, but maybe tease this out a little bit. What was the Japanese plan and objective, and how did the Americans come to know so much about both?
Well, they never quite settle on one strategy. This is one reason why in the kind of post-mortem of the war, why some scholars say Japan did not win, is because they didn't necessarily pick one strategy and stick to it. But by the time the Midway operation takes place, what they're hoping for is what they would like to do is attack Midway Island, which it's midway between the west between California and Japan. They're going to attack Midway Island, and by doing so, they'll capture the island itself, and they'll draw out the U.S. fleet to try to recapture the island. And when that happens, the Japanese fleet will ambush them. So the Japanese see it as, or they're hoping that it will be the beginning of an ambush. And by doing this, they'll not only destroy the U.S. fleet, but they'll control Midway, which is the gateway to Hawaii, and that is the gateway to the continental U.S. So they see this as kind of key terrain for attacking the U.S. later down the road. But primarily, it's about drawing out the U.S. fleet so they can destroy it in an ambush.
There is an aphorism which I thought I had correct, and I looked it up, and I was 99% right. I had the author wrong. And the aphorism is, every battle is won before it's ever fought. I thought it was Confucius, and it's Sun Tzu. Is Midway an example of this?
You're getting to the heart of Midway scholarship.
That's what we do here on the Leaders and Legends podcast. Yeah. We try to sound smart.
Yeah, well, I mean, this is kind of, if you think about the way some of the first, probably one of the first major books on the battles written by one of the participants, Japanese sailor or aviator, Mitsuo Fushida. He publishes a book about the battle in the 1950s. And he argues that it's hubris, that the Japanese are overconfident going into the war. And so he would agree. He would say that the battle is, in his sense, it's almost an inversion of your quote, because in his way of thinking, the battle is lost before it's ever begun. He doesn't necessarily see it as a battle the Americans win so much as one that the Japanese lose. And that's really the kind of keystone of a view that the outcome of the battle is determined by luck. And what Brendan and I push back on in that view in our book, because, obviously luck plays a role on, or I guess you could call it divine providence or fortune. It plays a role in all our lives. There's times when things happen to us and we can't necessarily explain why they turned out the way they did. And then definitely in war, you have that all the time. There's things that happen and you can't explain why one person lived and another person didn't. But that doesn't mean that skill doesn't play a role. And I think when you look at the U.S. victory in the battle and the reasons why the U.S. won, skill is essential. And so that's something that I think with regard to the quote, the battle's won before it begins. Well, skill doesn't, just because you have skill doesn't mean that you can just coast through. You still have to fight. And in the case of Midway, these, guys like Dusty Clice still had to wake up at 3 a.m. On the day of battle, get into their flight suit, have their last breakfast. For some of whom it was their last breakfast. Get in their planes, take off, fly the it was just under 200 miles to the Japanese fleet, find the fleet because they're just flying across open sea, and then attack. They had to actually dive on the plane and put their munitions where they wanted them to go. So, in that sense, absolutely not. The battle is not won, as you're sailing, to attack the enemy. You still have to go through all that and take those risks and perform your job, do your job well.
You're listening to the Leaders and Legends podcast. Our guest is Steven McGregor. He, along with Brendan Sims, wrote a phenomenal book called The Silver Waterfall: How America Won the War in the Pacific at Midway. I will read another review. Quote, "It's been written about many times before, but the story of the 1942 Battle of Midway has never been described for the reader in this special way. A fine blend of narrative and analysis. It's a treat." So says probably the greatest living diplomatic and naval historian, and that's Paul Kennedy from Yale University. I wrote down 5 things, and why don't you, if you want, ascribe a percentage to them that explains the American victory or the Japanese loss. Ingenuity, strategy, skill, luck, errors.
Okay, so then L has to add up to 100, right?
Yes, sir.
Okay, can you give them to me again? Ingenuity, skill, luck, errors.
Ingenuity, strategy, skill, luck, errors.
Yeah, I suppose. Well, it's interesting because skill. So strategy and skill, they overlap, and ingenuity in a way. Because skill, what skill is so comprehensive. It includes so many things. I mean, if you think of them, for instance, so as I mentioned, part of the reason why Nimitz was an effective leader in this and in the role that he was put into as commander in chief of the Pacific Fleet. Part of the reason he was effective is because he went on the offense, and it's that ingenuity. I mean, I think. I'm sort of dodging your question.
That's okay. For example, where this was just the skill of our dive bomber pilots at a higher level than the skill of the Japanese dive bomber pilots. Did we get lucky in the sense that we broke their code? And when they said that AF's desalination plant wasn't working, I mean, that's ingenuity. It's luck. My point is that, when you read Miracle at Midway by Gordon Prong and your theory in the book, which you talked about a few minutes ago, that this wasn't just, we happened to get lucky and roll a 7. It's much more complicated to that. And that's what I thought that was so refreshing about your book is it said, yeah, well, luck's a part of any war. It's part of any facet of life. But this was a victory that was well planned, well fought, and well constructed in terms of the equipment that was used.
Yes, and I guess it's a really interesting question. Were our pilots better than Japanese? Because in some ways they weren't, and some because they had been fighting in combat for longer. Now, the Americans had some combat experience. So because Nimitz goes on the offense and because of the island raids in late, it's sort of the very last day of January, and then there's a couple in February and one in March. Because of these island raids, the guy, Dusty Kleiss and the other pilots who dive on the Japanese fleet in the Battle of Midway, they've had experience in combat, so they're not doing this for the first time. But the Japanese are certainly much more experienced. So in that respect, they weren't necessarily better, but they were very, very capable. Because someone like Dusty Kleiss, he gets to the Enterprise Air Group in May of 1941. So before Pearl Harbor. So he's been with the group. He's been flying his plane, before Pearl Harbor takes place, before the war begins. So what he does in war, he has done in peacetime. So it's a peacetime Navy that is there for the Battle of Midway. But I suppose for the percentages, it's just tough because, when you think of, I'll give you another example. When the American planes, when they take off to attack the Japanese fleet on the morning of the 4th of June, you have 3 American carriers. Well, one carrier, the Hornet, the planes just go completely to the west and they overshoot the Japanese fleet. So they're essentially, it's as if they weren't even in the battle. And historians are still confused as to why they did this. And is that luck? Is that an error? It's definitely an error. But what's the reason for this error? It's hard to say. And then if you then look at the planes who actually do find the Japanese, the 27 of them are diving on the same carrier. It's normal. They get confused when the targets are assigned, and so this huge amount of the majority of the planes start diving on the same carrier. Well, one pilot recognizes this and says, Dick Best, and he signals to his wingman to follow him, and he chooses another carrier. So you have 27 planes diving on the Kaga, and only 3 planes dive for the Akagi. Well, it's Dick Best's split-second decision when he saw the group going for the one target. It was his split-second decision to say, no, follow me. I'm going to go to this other one. That means that America got one hit on the Akagi, and that one hit sank the whole carrier. So, that decision, that is, because is that one decision? Is that skill? Is that skill, or is that luck? Because he was a great pilot. He was very capable. So when he says, "Oh no, I'm going to take this chance," follow me. In a way, that's luck. In a way, it's ingenuity. So he's kind of, it's being a good pilot. I don't know. Pilots are, they have this mystical approach to their trade. I mean, I don't know if you can split hairs with them. I mean,
my brother's an airline pilot. I get it completely.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
So let me ask maybe a corollary to that, because I thought it was interesting in how much you and Professor Sims included first person accounts.
Mm-hmm.
And then my father's uncle, drove a Higgins boat in 8 major landings in the Pacific, including Okinawa.
Wow.
And you didn't really talk to him about it a little bit at all when you were a kid, but as you got older, he's since deceased, but you could ask him questions. And it was interesting to hear a lot of his comments because you didn't read them in books. Now you do. How important, one thing that he said was they can write, what I'm trying to get this right. They can write all the books they want, make all the movies they want, but they can't replicate the smell. So how important is it to you as an author, as an historian, to get a chance, as you were mentioning a few minutes ago, to sit down with someone who is there or chronicle someone's participation through letters and make it a part of the overall narrative?
It's very important. I mean, you're right. I mean, the smell, because you think about someone like Nimitz when he steps off the plane on Christmas morning of 1941, you had 5 American battleships at the bottom of the harbor. That would have smelled. He would have smelled the oil, the smoke, the rotting, the burn, the flesh been burning. I mean, because it had been weeks now since the 7th of December. So yeah, it would have. I mean, that it does. It has an impact. I mean, I think part of the issue is, when guys talk about what they did in the past, you never remember what your kind of major life events completely accurately. I mean, Dusty Clyce says this in his autobiography that he published in 2016. So he's born in 1916 and his autobiography is published in 2016, the year he dies. So he's 100 when he writes it, and he says himself, he says, you should always be wary of soldiers' stories, because whatever they tell you, it's going to make them look good. It can often make them look good, and there is, you do have a bit of this, but and probably some of the best sources in this regard are diaries, because they're written as events unfold. So Cleo Dobson, he was a dauntless pilot on the Enterprise. And for the Battle of Midway, he was actually a landing signals operator. So he was the guy on the deck, sort of saying to the guys, take off or land, and you're correct. Your angle of approach is good for landing. So he was controlling things on the deck. So he's not in the battle as a pilot, but he's involved in the crew, and he keeps a diary which was published by his family. You can buy it on Amazon. And I spoke with members of his family, and he says in his diary, his kind of comments on life aboard ship and their response to the battle. He writes it was a turning point. He says the Battle of this day will be a turning point in the war. And he says this, it's like the day after the battle. It's like in the 5th of June or 6th of June. He's saying this. And yeah, he talks about the fights he would get in with the guys and sort of what he thought. And so what he liked about it. So you get a bit more of the light and dark reading these contemporary sources, and it does make a difference. Those perspectives make a huge difference.
Japanese ever have a chance to achieve victory as they would have defined it, both not necessarily in the battle, but in the war as a whole? Yamamoto is famous, Admiral Yamamoto, for saying we've wakened a sleeping giant, and a lot of the things that you quote, a lot of the people you quote realize what the Japanese realize what they're up against. And so in the great folly of military errors throughout the century, Japan's decision to go to war against the United States just seems to be in the top rank of those. As a historian, could you construct a way for the Japanese to quote unquote win?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because some of the harshest judgments on some of the Japanese officers by historians is kind of aimed at Admiral Nagumo, he's sort of the one on the Japanese carriers. He's on the Akagi, and he's kind of executing the plan that Yamamoto has constructed. And the tendency is to think of him as too conservative, as overly conservative, hesitant, not aggressive enough. But I think, as we were kind of sort of going over, as we studied everything for the book, it's important to remember the Japanese, very successful Navy. They've been fighting in the Pacific since 1931 when they invade Manchuria, and they've been doing very well. And then they've been taking a lot of territory, winning a lot of battles. And Pearl Harbor is seen, they could have accomplished more than they did at Pearl Harbor, but it was still this astonishing a successful strike. And in a lot of ways, the reason why they didn't accomplish more was just because the U.S. carriers happened to be out bringing supplies to some of the island outposts. So that wasn't necessarily, it could have gone a different way. And if they had hit the carriers, then that would have had the attack on Pearl Harbor would have had a much bigger impact. So I think what I'm saying is I just think the Japanese right to be confident. So when Mitsuo Fushida says they were hubristic and overconfident, I'm thinking, man, but they were actually really good. I mean,
well, they were winning all over the Pacific, in the Philippines, and in the Dutch islands, Indonesia, and the list goes on and on. They were a string of unbroken victories for 2 or 3 months.
Yes, exactly. So this is where I think you can understand why attacking the U.S. seems like, well, what we can do this. We can bring them out. We can have so we can lure them into a decisive battle. We can win that, and then we'll have a short war, sue for peace, and we'll establish an empire for ourselves here in the Pacific. So I think there's a way in which I think strategically, if they had just picked one strategy and said, attacking Midway is difficult because even if they had captured it, logistically, it would have been a nightmare for them to support it. So I probably wouldn't have gone so far east if I was them. I would have either gone south or west. And so there was certainly, but the Axis powers themselves had a bit of a problem because they never really cooperated very well. They were very wary of one another. The Germans didn't really trust the Japanese and vice versa. And obviously then you have the Russians who changed sides. So they're not necessarily a great ally. Whereas like the US and the UK, they cooperate, relatively or comparatively much better. I mean, we're sharing all kinds of, radar. The US gets radar from the British. So the Axis powers were almost kind of flawed from the start in that respect. But certainly I think if the Japanese had they had gone south or west, it might have turned out better for them than pushing east or looking for the decisive victory.
We here in Indianapolis have a special affinity for Midway due to the critical leadership role of Admiral Raymond Spruance, a graduate of our own Shortridge High School. And he also had the doomed USS Indianapolis as his flagship. Please talk just a minute about Admiral Spruance's conduct and leadership and decision making. He was not a carrier commander, but Admiral Bull Halsey, I think, had shingles and could not participate, and he was selected. Spruance was selected to take his place. It's in the original movie Midway, which I think maybe 76. He's played by Glenn Ford. It's a terrific movie. I like the first version of Midway better than the second version, maybe just because of the stars who are in it. But talk to us a little bit about how Spruance did and how new that role was for him.
Yeah, so we were saying, we mentioned this before the show because it's so funny. You have all these guys from the Midwest end up in the Navy, and Chester Nimitz is somewhat similar, and he's from Fredericksville, Texas, and Fredericksburg, Texas, and then Dusty Kleiss is from Coffeyville, Kansas. So you got this Midwest kind of contingent going strong in the Navy, and I don't know if they're trying to escape or what, but yeah. So Spruance, who knows? But Spruance, I think it was Sam Morrison, the historian, who called him the electric brain because he was very sort of cool and collected aboard ship and making decisions. And each of the officers, they would kind of establish a different personality. And like Halsey, as you mentioned, is more gregarious, louder, sort of physical presence than Spruance was. And Spruance is tapped, to become part of this, part of the battle, pretty much at the last minute. And I suppose it's a testimony to the professionalism of the naval officers that they're able to kind of work, that they're still able to work together under those conditions, and also that Nimitz comes up with a plan that they're able to implement, that he can communicate to them and that makes sense to them. Nimitz stays in Hawaii. He stays at Pearl Harbor when he out the U.S. carriers for battle to go and prepare their ambush for the Japanese fleet, whereas Yamamoto travels with his ship. So. I think Spruance definitely was a great example of that, of sort of, at the last minute, you're told this is something you need to do, you need to be ready for this, and he's ready.
Leaving aside the post-nuclear age, is it fair to describe the United States Navy in the Pacific theater as the single greatest fighting force in the history of the world?
I suppose it would depend
If
on
not
what sort of.
greatest, if not greatest, how about powerful?
Yeah, well, they definitely. I think. I mean, amphibious warfare, island warfare, and especially as we talked about in the beginning, we talked about how large the Pacific theater is. I mean, it's just huge, and so it's a logistical problem. Even just moving around. Then they had problems of dividing up who was responsible for what, and you had someone like MacArthur involved, and he was, I mean, you say, so some of these personalities, like he's incredibly, and actually Craig Simmons goes into this in his recent biography on Nimitz. He talks about sort of how problematic that could have been. And actually, in Simmons's view, and I think there's really something to this, Nimitz was humble enough to be able to work with someone like MacArthur and even someone like Ernest King, who is Nimitz's superior back in Washington. Even he had a rough sort of personality. So I think there was, they were definitely able to work together well. And in a difficult environment, this enormous theater, and then the job they had was an incredibly, it was grisly, it was violent, it was tough. Amphibious warfare, taking these islands, taking ground, carrier warfare. This is, I mean, it's brutal. So for them to be able to do all that with the professionalism that they had, I mean, yeah, it's incredibly impressive. And yeah, it was, and definitely the Navy has to be able to do everything. So they have to have Marines to do things on the ground, to be infantrymen. They have to have pilots. They have to have sailors. So there is, a huge range of things they're doing. And in that sense, I suppose they're almost like an Army task force where they have kind of everything integrated into the unit. It's not just, some infantry guys. It's kind of, they kind of have people to do every job, and so they construct airfields, they construct barracks and places for people to live, entire cities. So I mean, it's incredibly, it's very impressive what's accomplished. And so yeah, it's remarkable.
We've reached the point in the Leaders and Legends podcast where we ask the same 5 questions of all of our guests. Steven McGregor, are you ready?
I'm ready.
This is the intellectual equivalent of jump school, so I know you can do it.
Hey, just keep my feet and knees together. I'm all set. Yeah.
What was your first job?
My first job it was in Florida, where I grew up. It was commercial landscaping, so I was basically mowing lawns. We woke up very early so that it wouldn't get too hot, because you basically finish by kind of early afternoon. And it was very good preparation for the infantry. I tell you, it's similar kind of work.
Question number 2. What was your first concert?
First concert, I don't think I can actually remember. I did see, I would say recently, I just
You don't remember the concert, or you don't remember you were there?
Well, I was trying to think. I was like, what would the concert be? I can think of my mic. So recently I just saw Peter Andrzejewski. He's a Polish pianist, and he just played some fugues. Did a performance of several Bach fugues here in Cambridge, which was incredible. He played his final piece was a sonata, Beethoven sonata in A flat, which I like classical music quite a bit, and it was just. I'm still thinking about that performance. It was 2 months ago, and it was very good. It was very good.
If you could recommend any book for someone to read, which book would you recommend?
I would say this writer I really love, Milan Kundera. He's from Eastern Europe, and he wrote a collection of short stories. It's called Laughable Loves. And I mean, it's very irreverent. It's very funny, but I think he dealt a lot with totalitarianism in his day with the Soviets, and I feel like this theme of totalitarianism, it's very relevant for us now in the West. And so I think his work has just really spoken to me in sort of over the last couple of years.
If you could witness any event in history, be there in person as it happens, which event would you choose?
For this, so the book I'm working on right now is about it's about this U.S. foreign policy during the American Civil War, when France invades Mexico.
Mm-hmm.
As our war is taking place, France invades Mexico. And I think that our Secretary of State then, William Seward, I think that when he was in his 20s, he met Louis Napoleon, the man who becomes Napoleon III, the second emperor of he's leader of the Second French Empire. And I think they actually meet in New York in the spring of 1837 at the house of Chancellor Kent. So I'm not 100% certain of this yet. So I would love to be at that house in the spring if they do meet. And then I'm able to see, like, what is it they're talking about? What's their conversation like? Do they enjoy meeting each other? I mean, because, let's go on to become incredibly influential leaders.
I've read a biography of Seward. It's been a few years ago, and I've read 3 or 4 books on Louis Napoleon, Napoleon III. It's always interesting in his procurement of women that they were all told you may kiss the emperor any place upon his body except the mouth. That's so French.
Yeah, Napoleon is he was a
bit of a rake.
He was a bit of a rake. He was. Maybe he might actually fit too well in our. He would have a TikTok or something.
But what he did for Paris can never be repaid. The brilliance of rebuilding Paris. Last question: if you could have dinner with anyone living today, 2 hours off the record, just to chat, whom would you choose?
I just read this interview with Simon Mann. I'd never heard of him before. He went to Eton and he joined the Scott Guards. It's a regiment here in the British Army. Then the SAS, and then he set up. He left the military and set up a private military contracting company and was involved in coups all over Africa. So he fought in Angola and Sierra Leone, and ended up in prison at one point because he was part of a coup that didn't work out. I mean, the guy was fascinating, such an interesting, as like a soldier and adventurer. I would love to meet him. He just sounded like, because he had interesting perspective on history and on politics, and and he clearly had been through a lot in his life. So Simon Mann, I think I would say, sort of, he's almost a man from another age, it seems.
You have been listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast presented by Veteran Strategies, an Indiana-based public relations enterprise, and sponsored by Girl Scouts of Central Indiana, Garmong Construction, Leaders and Legends LLC, the Grand Hall and Conference Center at Historic Union Station, the McGinley's Golden Ace Inn, and NFP, a national insurance broker with strong local content. Our guest today has been Steven McGregor. He is a member of the 101st Airborne Division. He was awarded a Purple Heart. And after his military service, he moved to England and completed his postgraduate studies in history at the University of Cambridge, and along with co-author Brendan Sims, wrote The Silver Waterfall, How America Won the War in the Pacific at Midway. Steven, thank you for your service. It was obviously incredibly brave. Thank you for coming on the Leaders and Legends podcast, and we'd love to have you back on someday.
Thank you, Robert.
Thank you very much for listening to Leaders and Legends, brought to you by Veteran Strategies Incorporated. If you want to contact us about this program or our menu of public relations services, please send us an email at robert@veteranstrategies.com. That's robert@veteranstrategies.com.
This podcast was produced and edited by Chris Spangle and Leaders and Legends, LLC. If you're interested in starting a podcast or taking yours to the next level, please contact us at leadersandlegends.net.